As a junior in high school back in North Carolina in the early 1960s, I had discovered a book by Clifton Fadiman called The Lifetime Reading Plan, and it was a book about all the great authors and the great works that everybody ought to read before they die. And I decided I was going to read every one of them. One of them was Civil Disobedience. It was short, seemed like a good place to start. So I went to my high school library and I looked for a copy of it, and I found a copy in a reference work called The World's Great Thinkers, and I checked it out. Because it was a reference work, it was an overnight book. It was due back the next day. I read the essay and I came back the next morning and I turned the book in between first and second period, and I was informed that the book was late. It should have come in before first period. So I said, okay, I'll pay the fine. And at that time in my high school, the fine was 2 cents a day. So I got out my 2 pennies and I was told, no, it's a reference book. The fine is 25 cents. And I stopped and said, wait a minute. What do you mean the fine is? First of all, no one told me I had to turn it in before first period. I thought it was overnight, just any time of the day was okay. And nobody told me the fine for a reference work was 25 cents. And then I looked at the back of the book and I pointed out the dates when this book had been checked out. And I pointed out that nobody had checked out this book in years. And in my high school, nobody was liable to check it out again for years. So I had not deprived anyone of reading this work. And I was told, I'm sorry, the fine is 25 cents. And I said, this fine is unjust and I will not pay it. At that point, or shortly after that, I got a note from the principal and he informed me that I owed 25 cents and I must pay this fine. I still refused to pay it. The summer went by. I came back for my senior year and I got a note from my high school principal informing me I still owed 25 cents and if I didn't pay it, I was not going to get my diploma. I still refused to pay it. And at that point, he called my mother, who didn't know anything about this. And she was very upset, and she went to meet the high school principal in person. And just like somebody paid Thoreau's fine to get him out of jail, my mother paid the 25 cents for me to get my diploma, which proves, I think, two things. First, I had absorbed the lessons of civil disobedience. And secondly, history really does repeat itself as farce. A few years ago, I was home for Christmas and I came downstairs for breakfast and I had on my Thoreau Society t-shirt. My father was at the breakfast table and he looked up and looked at that t-shirt and said, "That's what went wrong." I'll tell you that as a scholar, I'm a historian of ideas by trade, and I'm interested in a very simple question. Where do ideas come from and where do they go? And in terms of Thoreau, I've been interested in my work in two things. I've been interested in his role in the anarchist tradition, and I've been interested in his role in what we might call the philosophy of adventure, and that's a term that I take from Edward Abbey. In fact, my presentations here earlier have dealt with various bits and pieces of his role in these traditions, but I wanted to take the occasion today to try to pull this together into some coherent picture because, in fact, anarchism and the philosophy of adventure have a natural affinity for each other, and I think they show that affinity in the work of Thoreau. First of all, let me address the idea of Thoreau as anarchist, and I'll tell you I know that I've run into resistance with this group before in terms of dealing with that. There are a lot of Thoreauvians and Thoreau scholars who don't want to see him as an anarchist, don't want to understand him that way. And it's not just with this group. I was writing an article in a reference work on anarchism a few years back, and as part of the article I referred to the American anarchist Henry David Thoreau, and my editor took that reference out. He left the section on Thoreau in, but that reference was a little bit too much for him to take. So I know I've run into resistance with that, but the interesting thing for me is you don't run into resistance from the anarchists themselves. If you look at Emma Goldman in her essay, Anarchism, What It Really Stands For, in which she outlines her own theory of anarchism, she refers to Thoreau as the greatest American anarchist, a quote from her. And she also draws heavily on civil disobedience, the ideas and the language of civil disobedience, to feed into her theory of anarchism and what it is. The scholars of anarchism, the historians of anarchism, include Thoreau whenever they are discussing the history and development of anarchism. Civil disobedience is a regular fixture in anthologies of anarchist literature. So among the historians of anarchism and anarchists themselves, they certainly see him fitting into where they are, and so do I. Let me be clear what I mean by that. When I'm talking about anarchism, I'm talking about the vision of a society without a coercive state. What I'm referring to here when I say that he fits into anarchism, he did not call himself an anarchist, and the reason he didn't is that term didn't come into common usage until the 1870s. I don't mean that he was part of that anarchist movement that emerged in Europe in the late 19th century that was associated with the labor movement that engaged in assassination of political leaders and that was brought here by European immigrants into America in the late 19th century. What I do mean is that he really was associated with two kinds of anarchism that emerged in the United States and were peculiarly American in the early 19th century. One brand of anarchism that was out there in the antebellum period was individualist anarchism. And that individualist anarchism stemmed from the ideas of a British political thinker, William Godwin, who in 1796 published a book called An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. And Godwin in that book analyzed authority. And what he argued is there are two kinds of authority. There is coercive authority. That's the kind of authority that I have over you because I can threaten, force, or coerce you to do what I want you to do. But the other kind of authority is authority based on superior knowledge or wisdom. That's the kind of authority we're referring to when we say somebody is an authority on a certain subject. It means that they know a great deal about it. They probably know more than we do. And if we're wise, we'll voluntarily follow their leadership in that particular area. What Godwin argued is only the second kind of authority, authority based on superior knowledge or wisdom, is legitimate authority. Coercive authority is always illegitimate. But the authority of government, he argued, is always coercive authority. It's not that the government knows more than you know. It's that the government has the ability to force you to do what it wants you to do through force or coercion. And for Godwin, since coercive authority is always illegitimate, government is always illegitimate and should be done away with. What he called for people to do was to seek the truth for themselves, to speak out against injustice, to passively resist injustice if they could. He contemplated violence might be necessary, but it would certainly be the last resort to fight against injustice. But Godwin's ideas were out there. Let me be clear that Godwin had a following in America. Shelley, poet Shelley, was Godwin's son-in-law. Shelley was a Godwinian. Shelley's political ideas gained a following among Americans in antebellum America. One of our earliest novelists, Charles Brockden Brown, was a Godwinian. And more important for our purposes, Bronson Alcott was a Godwinian. In fact, if you look at Alcott, of course, Alcott went to jail 3 years before Thoreau did for refusing to pay his taxes. And the ideas of Godwin were certainly alive and well known here in Concord during Thoreau's time. Josiah Warren, who is another American individualist anarchist in the early 19th century, extended individual anarchism further. He talked about what he called individual sovereignty. That ultimate political authority ought to reside in the individual human being. And he called for individuals to secede from the state and literally become their own countries, their own nations. So individualist anarchism was out there in a big way. The other kind of anarchism you were looking at in the early 19th century in America was Christian anarchism. And that Christian anarchism existed among radical pacifists in this country. They called their position non-resistance. We're talking about William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist. We're talking about John Humphrey Noyes, who is the founder of the Oneida community. And their position essentially was this: violence is a sin. They're radical pacifists. Violence is a sin, and we should stop violence immediately. We should stop sinning immediately. But if violence is a sin, all governments are sinful because all governments rest on violence and coercion. So if all governments are sinful, all governments should be abolished. Their slogan was, no law but God's laws and no government but God's. And in fact, John Humphrey Noyes announced in 1837 he was seceding from the United States, that he would no longer give his allegiance to the government of the United States. So they had arrived at a very similar position that the individualist anarchists had, coming at it from a different angle. If you look at Thoreau, his essays bear the stamp of all of these varieties of anarchism. What you find is his idea that the state, in fact, the authority of the state rests on coercive authority. His essay on John Brown, he writes, "We preserve the so-called peace of our community by deeds of petty violence every day. Look at the policeman's billy and handcuffs. Look at the jail. Look at the gallows." In civil disobedience, what he said is the reason in democracy that majorities rule is not because they know more. It is because they are physically the strongest. That is, their authority is coercive authority, even in democracy. And at the end of civil disobedience, the last paragraph, he talks about, quote, "the authority of government such as even I am willing to submit to." And what he says is, quote, "I will cheerfully obey those who know and can do better than I do. I will follow you if you know more than I do." That's real authority. This is straight William Godwin that we're looking at in Thoreau. He talks about in civil disobedience, his position essentially is that the individual should secede from the state. In fact, what he says is, "I'm not a no-government man, I ask at once for a better government." What he's doing there is, in saying I'm not a no-government man, he's not disavowing a version of anarchism. He is separating himself out from the Christian anarchists. No law but God's, no government but God's. What he's saying is, that's not my position. Don't abolish the government immediately, but I call for a better government, and the better government will recognize the right of the individual to secede and let them go on their way and live with them as neighbors. So what we've got is Thoreau drawing on these earlier kinds of anarchism in his ideas. Because he's reaching back to the anarchists and drawing on this, and because his ideas, look at where they go forward to people like Emma Goldman. I see him firmly in this anarchist tradition, at least as I look at him as a historian of ideas. But what sets him apart and what makes him different from the other anarchists in the antebellum period is that he ties his version of anarchism to what we might call the philosophy of adventure. And I want to talk about that for a few minutes. And to talk about that, I want to go back and refer to a book by a literary critic named Paul Zweig, which came out in 1974. That book was called The Adventurer. And in that book, what Zweig argues was that adventure was central to ancient cultures. The adventurer in ancient cultures was the man who went out to explore unknown lands. Odysseus was the prime model of this. And the reason adventurers were valued in ancient cultures, he argued, was for the stories that they brought back. Because the stories were stories of tales beyond the world of men. They were stories of unknown lands. And adventurers were valued because their stories expanded human knowledge. But what Zweig argued was, in Western culture, beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries, adventure is banished to the margins of the culture. Adventure was no longer central in Western culture. With the rise of the Protestant ethic, work was central to Western culture. What the Protestant ethic expected was that you would get married, have a family, work to support that family, that you would engage in regular conduct, you would obey the law, you would obey whatever morality was conventional at the time, you would internalize these values so you would feel guilty or ashamed if in fact you violated these values. This is the rise of what Zweig called domestic values. And so in the 19th century, adventure came to be regarded as frivolous or even sinful activity.